"You've been left, Miss Foster. Left like garbage on a platform." The station master's words hit her like a slap as the train's whistle faded into the Montana dust. Lillian Foster gripped her one suitcase, the marriage letters crumpled in her fist, and looked around at a town full of strangers who saw only a burden. Then a shadow fell across her, a tall rancher with eyes that had buried their own grief. He didn't ask her name. He simply said the 6 words that would change everything. Subscribe now and comment your city below. Let's see how far this story travels together. The letter was still in her pocket when the train pulled away. Lillian Foster stood on the platform at Promise Creek, Montana, and felt the wind take the last warm breath of the locomotive's steam and scatter it into nothing, the same way it seemed to be scattering the last 11 months of her life. 11 months of careful correspondence. 11 months of a stranger's handwriting promising her a future. 11 months of believing that a man named Ethan Wallace was real, was decent, was waiting for her at the end of 1,000 miles of track. She looked left. She looked right. Dust. Horses. Men in canvas coats loading crates onto a wagon. A dog barking at nothing. No one was waiting for her at all. "Ma'am." She turned. A boy no older than 14 stood holding her second trunk, the one the porter had set down on the platform and abandoned along with everything else in her life that morning. "Where do you want this?" Lillian opened her mouth and found she had no answer. Where did she want it? She didn't know where she wanted anything anymore. She had crossed a continent believing she knew exactly where she belonged, and now she was standing in a town she'd never seen, waiting for a man who apparently didn't exist. Just leave it there," she said. "Thank you." The boy set it down and looked at her a moment too long, the way people look at something that doesn't belong, something out of place like a chair left out in the rain. Then he walked off, and Lillian Foster was alone. She waited an hour. She told herself it was traffic on the road, or a horse that had thrown a shoe, or some other small forgivable delay. Men were late. Men got held up. It didn't mean anything. She waited a second hour. By then the platform had emptied of everyone except the station master, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and a mustache stained yellow from tobacco, who kept glancing at her from inside his little office window, like she was a problem he didn't want to deal with, but couldn't quite ignore. Finally, as the sun began sinking low enough to throw long orange shadows across the dust, he stepped outside. "Miss," he said, "you still here?" "I'm waiting for someone." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Ethan Wallace. He was supposed to meet me at the station. Perhaps you know him. Perhaps you could tell me where I might find him or send word." The station master's face did something complicated. Pity first. Then something harder, more resigned, like a man who has delivered bad news so many times he's worn smooth the part of himself that used to flinch at it. "Ethan Wallace," he repeated. "Yes, you corresponded with him by letter. For nearly a year, we were to be married." She heard how foolish it sounded, even as she said it out loud to a stranger on a dusty platform 3,000 miles from her mother's kitchen in Boston. "He sent for me. He said he had land a home ready, that he only needed money," the station master said flatly. He needed money. Lillian felt something cold slide down through her chest. "How did you know that?" The man sighed, the kind of sigh that carried the weight of having said this before more than once to more than one woman standing on this exact platform with a trunk and a folded letter and a heart full of foolish hope. "Because you ain't the first," he said. "Ethan Wallace ran the same play last spring on a widow from Ohio. Told her he had 200 acres and a cattle operation. Took $40 off her for travel arrangements before she even boarded her train, then, when she got here, gone. Vanished. Nobody's seen him in this town in 3 weeks. Word is he skipped out owing money to half the merchants on Main Street, too. Feed store, the saloon, old man Pruitt at the mercantile." Lillian's knees felt suddenly unsteady, and she reached out to brace her hand against the station wall, the wood rough and sun-warmed under her palm. "That's not possible," she whispered. "He wrote to me. He wrote such beautiful letters. He described the house, the mountains behind it, the creek running past the porch. Description of half the ranches in this valley. The station master said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. He probably rode past a dozen places and just wrote down what he saw. Didn't cost him nothing but ink. But why would he? Her voice cracked, and she hated that it cracked. Hated that this man was watching a stranger fall apart on his platform. Why would he ask me to come all this way if he never intended? Some men don't need a reason beyond meanness, the station master said. Or maybe he did have a plan and it went bad. Maybe he really did intend to marry you and then thought better of the whole arrangement once your money ran dry. Maybe he found himself a richer prospect. I don't know the man's mind, miss. I only know he's gone, and you're the fourth woman I've watched stand right where you're standing and ask me the same question. The fourth. Lillian pressed her hand to her mouth. Somewhere behind her, a horse stamped its foot against the packed dirt, and the sound seemed impossibly loud, impossibly ordinary, set against the way her entire world had just been quietly, efficiently dismantled. I have very little money, she said mostly to herself. I spent nearly everything on the fare and the trunk shipping. I have perhaps $6 to my name and a return ticket that won't be honored for 2 weeks. 2 weeks and 4 days, the station master corrected. Not looking at her now, looking instead at some middle distance, like a man who wanted very badly to be done with this conversation. Next eastbound with open seats isn't till then. I'm sorry, miss. Truly I am. But I can't make the train come faster, and I can't conjure your intended out of thin air. Best I can tell you is Widow Harmon 2 streets over sometimes takes in boarders, though I hear she's full up this month with the Hendricks family passing through. And if she's full, the station master didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was the answer, and it was the loudest thing Lillian had heard since she'd stepped off the train. He went back inside his little office, and through the window, she watched him pull down the shade. Not cruelly, just efficiently, the way a man closes up a shop at the end of a long day, because for him, this was simply the end of a long day. For her, it was the end of everything she'd built her future on. The sun kept sinking. Lillian sat down on her trunk because her legs would no longer hold her properly, and she watched Promise Creek go about the business of becoming evening. Lamps were lit in windows. A woman called a child in for supper. Somewhere a piano was being played badly and cheerfully in what she guessed was the saloon. Life continuing indifferent all around her while she sat in the middle of it with nowhere to go and no one who knew her name. She thought of her mother's face when she'd announced her plan to answer the advertisement. A mail-order arrangement. Lillian, you're an intelligent girl, you don't need to resort to. But there had been nothing else. Her father's debts had eaten the house. Her prospects in Boston had narrowed to genteel poverty, or worse, and Ethan Wallace's letters had seemed at the time like the only door still open to her. Now, even that door had been a lie. She became aware slowly that she was being watched. Not by the townspeople passing on the street, who mostly glanced at her with the same flicker of pity, then dismissal she'd gotten from the station master, categorizing her instantly as one of those women the ones men send for, and then abandon a category apparently well known enough in Promise Creek to require no further explanation. No, this was different. This was a stillness, a weight coming from somewhere to her left. She looked up. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered, an almost absurd amount of height made more pronounced by the way he stood with his weight settled back on his heels. Unhurried like a man who had never once in his life needed to rush toward anything. He wore a plain canvas coat, worn soft at the elbows, and a hat pulled low enough that for a moment she couldn't fully see his eyes, only the hard, clean line of his jaw and the several days' growth of beard along it. He was looking at her luggage, then at her. Then, and this was the part that would stay lodged in her memory for the rest of her life. The part she would return to again and again in the months that followed. He looked at her hands. She hadn't realized they were shaking until his gaze settled there, and something in her chest twisted with humiliation to be so thoroughly seen undone, catalogued by a stranger on a dark street. He crossed the space between them without asking permission, which should have alarmed her, and somehow didn't. "You're the one Wallace sent for," he said. It wasn't a question. "You know him. Everyone in this town knows him now. Knew him, I should say." His voice was low, unhurried, matching the rest of him. Word travels fast when a man skips out owing the feed store and 3 separate saloons. "Then you know he's not coming." "I know he's not coming." A pause. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that looked for just a moment like old grief surfacing and being pushed back down again by long practice. "Man like that doesn't come back for anything. Not money he owes, not promises he made, not women he's stranded on a train platform at sundown." "I don't know your name," Lillian said, and was faintly surprised at the steadiness returning to her own voice, some old Boston backbone reasserting itself even now, even here. "Luke Garrett." He didn't extend a hand. Just stood there solid as a fence post, studying her the way a man studies weather he's trying to read. "Own the double circle west of town. Lillian Foster." "I know." At her look, he added, "Small town. Word travels." She glanced down at her trunk, at the second one still sitting where the boy had left it, at the darkening sky pressing down over both of them, and felt the full weight of her situation crash back over her in a fresh wave. "I don't suppose," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded, "that you know anywhere I might find a room for the night." The station master mentioned a widow, but he said she was likely full. She is full. Hendrick's family took the last of her rooms 2 days back. Luke Garrett tilted his head slightly, studying her the way he might study a fence line to see where it needed mending. "You got kin anywhere near friends who might take you in?" "No one. I came alone." "Money." The bluntness of the question should have offended her. It didn't somehow. There was nothing predatory in the way he asked it, only a flat practicality, a man cataloging facts the way he might count cattle. "Very little," she admitted. "Enough for perhaps a week if I'm careful. Less if I need to pay for lodging." Luke was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Lillian felt her pride rear up hot and humiliated, ready to tell him she required no charity, that she would manage, that she'd find some solution on her own, even if she had to sleep on this very platform. "You've been waiting for me," he said. The words landed strangely, both too intimate and utterly without romance, spoken in the same flat, practical tone he'd used to ask about her money. "I beg your pardon." "Not like that." Something almost like the ghost of amusement crossed his face, gone as fast as it appeared. "I mean, I was headed into town for supplies when I heard talk at the Mercantile. A woman left at the station, no husband, no lodging. I came to see if it was true." He looked at her trunk again, then back at her face. "It's true. So you came to look at me, like everyone else." "I came because I know what it is to be left with nothing and no one telling you why." The words came out clipped quick, like he regretted them the moment they left his mouth, like he'd said more than he intended. He recovered fast, straightened, and his voice went back to that same even businesslike register. "I'm not offering you charity, Miss Foster. I don't have the patience for it, and neither, I suspect, do you." "Then what are you offering?" "A ride out to the double circle. A roof for tonight at least. Tomorrow we can talk about whether there's more to be worked out." "I don't know you, Mr. Garrett." "No," he agreed. "You don't. And you've got every reason in the world tonight not to trust a stranger's word." He gestured almost imperceptibly toward the darkening street, the shuttered station office, the town settling into a night that held no safe place for her. "But you also don't have a lot of other doors open to you right now. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I'd think less of you if you pretended otherwise either." It was, Lillian would think later, the strangest kindness she had ever been offered, the refusal to dress it up as anything other than what it was. Not romance, not rescue dressed in soft words. Just a hard fact laid plainly on the table: you have nowhere else to go, and I am offering you somewhere. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You don't know me. I could be anyone." "You could be," he agreed, "but I've got eyes. Miss Foster, and I've got 2 ranch hands who'll vouch I'm not in the habit of bringing trouble home. You'll have your own room. Door with a lock on the inside, not the outside. My housekeeper quit on me a month back to go live with her daughter in Bozeman. And I've been eating my own terrible cooking and losing track of which shirts are clean ever since. That's the whole of it. No mystery, no strings. Something in the utter lack of flourish in his offer made Lillian believe him more than any amount of gallant speech-making could have. And if I say no, then I'll help you carry your trunks to wherever you decide, and I'll wish you well, and that'll be the end of it. He shrugged an economical movement, nothing wasted. It's your choice to make. I'm not in the business of forcing anyone's hand. Lillian looked at the darkening street one more time. She thought of the station master pulling his shade down, closing his door on her problem, like it was nothing more than the day's last unpleasant chore. She thought of the $6 in her purse of the 2 weeks and 4 days until the next eastbound train of a town that had already sorted her in the space of a single afternoon into the category of woman men abandon. And she thought with a clarity that surprised her that she had come 1,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met on the strength of nothing but letters and hope. Whatever this was, whatever Luke Garrett was offering, it was at minimum more honest than that had been. "All right," she said. "One night, to see." "One night?" he agreed and reached for her trunk, before she could protest, hoisting it onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. "Wagons this way." The ride to the double circle took the better part of an hour, the wagon creaking over a rutted road that wound up out of the town proper and into open country. And Lillian spent most of it in silence, watching the last light drain out of the sky over mountains she couldn't yet name. Feeling the strange vertigo of a life turned entirely upside down in the space of a single afternoon. "You're quiet," Luke observed somewhere past the halfway point, his eyes on the road, the reins loose and easy in his hands. "I'm considering how thoroughly my plans have collapsed," she said. It seemed prudent to sit with that a moment before speaking. "Fair enough. May I ask you something, Mr. Garrett?" "You can ask. You said you know what it is to be left with nothing and no one telling you why." She watched his profile in the dimming light, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What did you mean by that?" For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer at all. The wagon wheels found a rut and jostled them both, and he adjusted the reins without comment, his eyes fixed forward on the darkening road. "Old story," he said finally. "Not one I tell to strangers on the first night." "That seems fair," Lillian said, and something in her chest loosened slightly at the honesty of the refusal. No false intimacy offered no manufactured closeness, just a plain admission that some things required more than a few hours' acquaintance to earn. They rode the rest of the way mostly in silence, and when the ranch house finally came into view, a low, sturdy structure, with lamplight glowing warm in 2 windows, set against a black wall of mountains. Behind it, Lillian felt something in her chest ease just slightly for the first time since the train had pulled away without her. It was not the house Ethan Wallace had described in his letters. It was better somehow in its plainness, a real place built by real hands, with none of the poetry and all of the substance. "Double circle," Luke said, drawing the wagon to a stop. "Not much to look at in the dark, better in daylight." "It looks sturdy," Lillian said, and meant it as the highest compliment she had to give after a day spent discovering exactly how flimsy a man's promises could be. Luke glanced at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and for just a moment in the lamplight spilling from the windows, she thought she saw the ghost of the same loss he'd refused to name on the road, old buried deep, the kind of grief a man learns to carry so quietly that most people never guess it's there at all. "Sturdy's what matters," he said, and swung down from the wagon to help her with her trunks. "Everything else is just decoration." He led her inside into a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and old coffee, and showed her a small room off the back hallway, narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over dark pasture toward the mountains, and stood in the doorway. A moment hat still in hand, looking suddenly less certain than he had all evening. "It's not much," he said. "It's more than I had 2 hours ago," Lillian said, and meant it. "There's a lock." He gestured at the door. "Inside bolt. You use it if it makes you easier in your mind." "Thank you, Mr. Garrett." "Luke," he said, "Mr. Garrett was my father, and I'd rather not be reminded of him more than I have to be." A flicker of something dark crossed his face, gone as quick as it came. Another door closing before she could see through it. "We'll talk in the morning. About the housekeeping arrangement, if you're still of a mind to consider it." "I am." He nodded. Once set her trunk down inside the door and left her alone with a lamp, a narrow bed, and the enormous echoing silence of a life that had been in the space of a single day, entirely rewritten. Lillian sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before she found the will to undress and blow out the lamp. Outside, somewhere in the dark, she could hear cattle lowing low and mournful, and the wind moving through grass she couldn't see, and underneath all of it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of boots on the porch outside. Luke Garrett still awake, still keeping some kind of watch though, over what or whom she couldn't yet say. She thought of Ethan Wallace's letters folded now at the bottom of her trunk, every beautiful lie in them curdled into something ugly and worthless. She thought of the station master's tired, resigned face. "You ain't the first." She thought of 6 words spoken by a stranger on a darkening platform. "You've been waiting for me," words that should have frightened her. That some other woman, in some other circumstance, might have taken for the opening line of a very different and much more dangerous kind of man. But she had looked into Luke Garrett's eyes when he said them, and she had seen no hunger there, no calculation. Only the same old grief she'd glimpsed twice now, and been refused an explanation for both times. Whoever he was, whatever waited for her in the days ahead. Lillian Foster fell asleep that night in a stranger's house farther from Boston than she had ever imagined being, and further still from the future she'd crossed a continent to claim. She did not yet know that Ethan Wallace's betrayal was not the last deception waiting for her in Promise Creek. She did not yet know that a banker named Howard Sinclair had already weeks earlier begun setting in motion a scheme that would reach into Luke Garrett's land, his history, and eventually her own safety. She only knew that for the first time since the train had pulled away and left her standing alone, she did not feel entirely abandoned. And in a house full of old grief and careful silences, that single fact felt for tonight like enough. Morning came hard and bright sunlight cutting through the thin curtain of the narrow room, and Lillian woke disoriented, reaching for a moment before her mind caught up with where she was and why. Not Boston. Not the train. A ranch called the Double Circle, a stranger's spare room, a lock she had in fact used the night before sliding the bolt home with a hand that still trembled slightly, even as her mind told her it wasn't necessary. She dressed quickly and found her way to the kitchen where the smell of burnt coffee hung thick in the air, and Luke Garrett stood at the stove, with his sleeves rolled up, scowling at a skillet like it had personally wronged him. "You're up early," he said, not turning. "I'm not accustomed to sleeping past sunrise." She glanced at the skillet at the blackened edges of what might once have been intended as eggs. "May I ask what that is?" "Breakfast. Allegedly." He set the skillet down with a grimace. "This is why Mrs. Calloway leaving put me in a bind. Woman could cook. I can barely keep a pot from catching fire." "Give me the skillet," Lillian said. Luke turned, eyebrow raised. "You cook?" "I ran my mother's kitchen for 6 years after her hands began troubling her with rheumatism." "I can cook, Mr. Garrett, and I can cook considerably better than whatever crime you were about to commit against those eggs." Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but close enough to it that Lillian felt an odd little jolt of satisfaction at having provoked it. He stepped back from the stove and gestured her forward with a mock formality that surprised her. "By all means," he said. "Save us both." She did. 20 minutes later, they sat across from each other at a scarred wooden table, a plate of properly cooked eggs and fried potatoes between them, and Luke ate 3 helpings before he spoke again, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decode. "You said last night you'd consider the arrangement," he said. "Housekeeping. I want to lay it out plain so there's no confusion between us." "Go on. Room and board, same as you had last night. Fair wage, I'll match what Mrs. Calloway was paid $12 a month more if the work runs heavier than expected during roundup season. You'd cook, keep the house, manage the wash. I've got 2 hands who work the cattle. Silas and a younger fellow named Boone, and they eat here most days too, so it's not light work, but it's honest work." He paused, set down his fork. And I want to be clear about the rest of it. This isn't a courtship. I'm not looking for a wife mail order or otherwise, and I'd never presume you came all this way looking to trade one arrangement for another, just because the first one fell through. I appreciate the clarity, Lillian said, and found she meant it. There was something almost restful in a man who said exactly what he intended and nothing more. You'll have your own room, your own lock, your own wages, that are yours to keep or save or send home, whatever you choose. In 2 weeks, if the eastbound train comes and you want to be on it, I'll drive you to the station myself and won't say a word to talk you out of it. And if I decide to stay longer than 2 weeks, then we'll talk about that when it comes. He picked his fork back up. One day at a time, Miss Foster. That's the only way I've ever known how to run anything. She thought about her $6, about the empty room waiting for her in Boston, that wasn't even truly hers anymore, since her father's debts had claimed the house, about a return journey to a city that held nothing for her but her mother's worried face, and the shame of having failed at the one plan she'd staked everything on. I accept, she said. Provisionally. Provisionally, he agreed, and something like relief moved through his shoulders, quick and then gone, like he'd been more worried about her answer than he'd let on. The work came at her fast in the days that followed, and Lillian threw herself into it with a fervor that surprised even her scrubbing floors that hadn't seen proper attention in a month. Reorganizing a pantry gone chaotic under Luke's haphazard management. Learning the rhythms of a household that ran on cattle schedules instead of the genteel Boston clock she'd grown up keeping. She met Silas first, a weathered man in his 50s, with a limp he never explained, and a gruffness that melted almost embarrassingly fast the moment she set a plate of biscuits in front of him. "Lord," he said around a mouthful. "Boss, you better not let this one get away." "She's not getting away, Silas. She's the housekeeper," Luke said flat, but Lillian caught the faint color rising along his jaw and filed it away, curious, unexamined. Boone was younger, maybe 20, all elbows and shy grins, and he took to calling her ma'am with such earnest formality that Lillian found herself laughing for what felt like the first time in weeks. "You don't need to call me Ma'am Boone. I'm not that much older than you." "Force of habit, ma'am. My mother'd skin me if I didn't." By the 4th day, a rhythm had settled over the household that felt disorientingly almost like belonging the men out with the herd by dawn. Lillian managing the house and garden through the long middle hours, supper on the table by the time the light started slanting gold across the pasture. Conversation around the table that ranged from cattle prices to weather to occasionally careful testing questions about her life before Promise Creek. "Boston," Luke said one evening, turning the word over like he was examining it for flaws. "Big city like that. Why answer an advertisement to come all the way out here?" Lillian set down her fork, considered how much to say. "My father died 2 years ago. Left considerable debts. I didn't know existed until the lawyers came to explain them. The house was sold to cover what he owed. My mother and I moved into rooms with my aunt, and I worked as a seamstress and a governess, whatever paid, but there was no future in it. No prospects for either of us beyond scraping by." She glanced up, met his eyes. "Ethan Wallace's advertisement promised land security, a home of my own. I know how foolish that sounds now." "Doesn't sound foolish," Luke said. "Sounds like a woman trying to build something out of very little. Nothing foolish in that." "You're kinder about it than I've been to myself." "I've got some experience with building things out of very little," he said, and something in his voice went quieter further away. "This ranch wasn't handed to me easy. Will you tell me about it?" She kept her voice light, careful not to press too hard against whatever door he kept so firmly shut. "Or is that still too soon for a stranger to ask?" Luke was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "My father built the double circle from nothing," he said finally. "Came out here in the 60s before the war even finished settling, staked his claim. Worked himself half to death, turning scrubland into something worth having. He was a hard man, harder than he needed to be most days. But he built something real, and I respected that even when I didn't much like him." "What happened to him?" "Died 6 years back. Heart gave out while he was mending fence of all the ordinary ways to go for a man who'd survived droughts and blizzards, and one particularly memorable stampede that should have killed him twice over. A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. Left the ranch to me. And left me a fiancée I'd been putting off marrying because I wanted to prove I could run the place first, show him I wasn't just riding on what he'd built. Something cold moved through Lillian's chest. She didn't ask. She waited. Her name was Sarah, Luke said, and his voice had gone flat now. Careful, the voice of a man reciting facts he'd worn smooth through long repetition to himself alone at night. We were to marry that spring. She took fever that winter, the kind that moves through a town fast and takes the ones you least expect. She was gone in 11 days. He looked up, and Lillian saw, finally unguarded, the grief she'd glimpsed twice before and been refused. I'd spent 2 years telling her not yet once, the ranch is solid, once I've proven myself. And then there was no yet left to wait for. Luke. Lillian reached across the table before she'd fully decided to her hand resting near his, not quite touching. I'm so sorry. It was 6 years ago. He said it like an apology for still carrying it, like grief past a certain age was supposed to be tidied away, and he was embarrassed to still have it out where someone could see. I don't tell people that story. I don't know why I'm telling you. Maybe because I understand something about waiting for a life that never arrives, Lillian said quietly. Something passed between them, then not quite understanding, not quite intimacy, but the first thin thread of something that hadn't existed between them 3 days earlier, spun out of shared loss and careful honesty, and Luke pulled his hand back, first cleared his throat, and the moment folded itself closed like a letter put away unfinished. Long day tomorrow, he said. Roundup starts on the north section. You'll have the house to yourself mostly. Silas and Boone and I will be out from sunup to well past dark. I'll manage, Lillian said, and meant it as more than a statement about the housework. She did more than manage. Over the following 2 weeks, Lillian Foster remade herself in the shape of the Double Circle Ranch, learned to bake bread in a wood stove that ran hot on one side and cold on the other, learned to mend fence-torn shirts and salve rope-burned hands, learned the particular silence of a house at midday, with the men gone, and nothing but wind and cattle lowing for company. She also learned slowly that Promise Creek held more danger than a single vanished con man. It started with small things. A conversation overheard at the Mercantile, where she'd gone with Boone to fetch flour and sugar. 2 women murmuring near the dry goods about that Sinclair business, and poor Garrett, first his father's debts, and now this. Excuse me, Lillian said, unable to help herself. Did you say Garrett Luke Garrett? The 2 women exchanged a look. You're the one staying out at the Double Circle, the older one said. It wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite an accusation, but it landed somewhere close to both. Housekeeper, is that right? Yes. What business were you referring to with a Mr. Sinclair? The older woman glanced toward the Mercantile counter, lowered her voice further. Howard Sinclair owns the bank, half the mortgages in this valley, and a considerable appetite for land that isn't his. He's had his eye on the Double Circle for 2 years now, ever since old man Garrett passed Truth Told. Been making offers to Luke, each one lower than the last, like he's trying to wear the boy down through pure persistence. Luke's turned him down every time, the younger woman added. But folks say Sinclair doesn't take no for an answer real gracious. Ask the Delacroix family what happened to their spread out past the river. What happened to it? The women exchanged another look, and this time the older one's mouth thinned into a hard line. Sinclair happened to it. That's all I'll say in a public store, miss. Best you ask Luke himself if you're staying out there. He'd know better than town gossip. Lillian carried the exchange home with her like a stone in her pocket, turning it over all afternoon. And that evening, once supper was cleared, and Silas and Boone had retired to the bunkhouse, she found Luke on the porch, staring out at the darkening pasture, with a stillness that seemed, now that she was learning to read him, less peaceful than watchful. I heard something in town today, she said. About a man named Sinclair. Luke's jaw tightened just slightly, a tell she was becoming fluent in. What did you hear? That he's wanted your land for 2 years. That he doesn't take rejection well. She sat down beside him on the porch step, close enough to speak quietly. "Is it true?" "It's true." Luke's voice had gone hard. Careful the voice he used when he was choosing his words with unusual precision. "Howard Sinclair holds the mortgage papers on half this valley. He's been buying up struggling ranches for pennies on the dollar for years, always with some sympathetic story about helping folks out of hardship. And somehow every family that sells to him ends up worse off than when they started, and every acre he acquires makes him richer and more powerful in this county. And he wants the double circle. Wanted it before my father died. Wants it more now." Luke's hands resting on his knees curled slowly into loose fists. "He's made 3 offers in 2 years, each one an insult. I've turned him down each time, and each time he smiled and said he understood, and each time something's happened afterward that I couldn't quite prove was connected, but couldn't quite believe was coincidence either." "What kind of something?" Fence lines cut cattle scattered into the hills where they take days to gather back. A barn fire 2 winters back that could have killed Silas if he hadn't woken when he did. Small things, each one deniable on its own. His voice dropped lower. "But add them up and it starts looking like a pattern, Lillian. Like a man testing how much pressure it takes before I break and sell." Lillian felt something tighten in her own chest. Not quite fear. Not yet. But the first cold edge of it, recognition that the danger surrounding her hadn't ended with Ethan Wallace's betrayal, that it had merely changed shape and settled into the very ground she was now standing on. "Why haven't you told anyone? The sheriff told him about the fence, about the fire. He looked into it, found nothing he could pin on Sinclair specifically. Man's careful. Never touches anything himself, hires it done 3 steps removed, so there's nothing but smoke by the time it reaches him." Luke exhaled slowly. "I don't say any of this to frighten you. You've got enough weighing on you already coming out here the way you did. I just don't want you caught unaware if something comes up." "I'd rather know," Lillian said. "I'd rather know and be prepared than be protected by silence and blindsided later." Luke looked at her. Then something shifting in his expression, some recalculation happening behind his eyes. "Most folks want to be protected from hard truths. You're not most folks. I've had enough hard truths sprung on me unprepared for one lifetime, Mr. Garrett. I'd prefer not to repeat the experience." A faint smile touched his mouth there, and gone. "Luke," he corrected gently. "I told you already." "Luke," she said, and the name felt different in her mouth than it had 3 days ago, less like addressing an employer and more like something else entirely, something she wasn't yet ready to name. The days that followed carried a new undercurrent danger threaded quietly beneath the ordinary rhythm of ranch life, and Lillian found herself watching the horizon more carefully, listening more closely to the particular sound of an unfamiliar horse approaching, though nothing happened for nearly a week that gave that watchfulness any justification. Then, on a Tuesday morning, bright with unseasonable warmth, a rider came up the long approach to the house, while Luke and the men were out on the North Range, and Lillian alone in the yard hanging wash, felt her stomach drop at the sight of an unfamiliar man in a fine dark coat. Entirely wrong for ranch country, dismounting near the porch with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being deferred to. "Good morning," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I'm looking for Luke Garrett." "He's out with the herd," Lillian said, keeping her voice even, though every instinct in her had gone taut and wary. "May I ask who's calling?" "Howard Sinclair." He smiled, and the smile didn't reach his eyes at all. A practiced expression worn smooth from long use the same way a coin goes smooth from passing through too many hands. "And you'd be the new housekeeper. Word travels fast in a town this size. Miss Foster, is that right? The one Wallace left standing at the station." Lillian's spine straightened. "I don't see how that's relevant to your business here, Mr. Sinclair." "No, I suppose it isn't." His eyes moved over her with a slow, assessing quality that made her skin crawl, cataloging her the way he might catalog a piece of property he was considering acquiring. "Forgive me. I only meant it as sympathy. Difficult thing being abandoned like that. I imagine you were quite desperate taking up residence with a man you'd only just met out here alone with him and his hired hands." The insinuation sat there in the warm morning air, ugly and deliberate, and Lillian felt heat rise in her face. Not embarrassment, she realized, but fury, clean and sharp. "I'm the housekeeper, Mr. Sinclair, employed, paid, and entirely respectable in my arrangements, which is more than I can say for some business dealings I've heard whispered about in this town." Something flickered in Sinclair's expression. Surprise maybe that she'd pushed back, rather than shrinking under his implication, and then the smile returned colder, now more calculating. "Sharp tongue on you. I like that, actually. Suggests intelligence." He glanced toward the empty pasture, toward the direction the herd had gone. "Tell Mr. Garrett I called. Tell him my offer stands 40% above his father's original assessed value for the land, a generous sum by any measure, and an offer that won't remain open indefinitely. Tell him I'd hate to see circumstances force his hand toward a less favorable arrangement." What circumstances would those be? Sinclair's smile widened just slightly, and for the first time, Lillian saw something genuinely dangerous move behind his pleasant banker's face. "Ranching is a precarious business, Miss Foster. Fires happen, fences fail, cattle wander. Even hired help sometimes decides a place isn't worth the risk of staying." His eyes held hers, steady, deliberate. "I'd hate for anything unfortunate to happen to someone as new to this arrangement as you are." The threat landed exactly as he intended it to, clear enough to be understood, vague enough to be denied, and Lillian felt real fear move through her chest for the first time since arriving in Promise Creek, colder and more immediate than anything the station master's news had made her feel. "I'll tell him you called," she said, keeping her voice level through sheer force of will. "You do that." Sinclair replaced his hat, swung back up onto his horse with practiced ease. "And Miss Foster, do consider your own interest here. A young woman alone, no family in this territory, entangled in another man's troubles. Should things go poorly for Garrett, I'd hate to see you caught in the wreckage of it. I'm a reasonable man. I could see my way to offering you a position should you find yourself in need of new employment. My household could use someone of your evident capability. I have no intention of leaving Mr. Garrett's employment, Mr. Sinclair. Not now, and not under threat." Something hard settled over Sinclair's face, the pleasant mask slipping just enough to show what lay beneath it. "That's unfortunate," he said quietly. "For everyone involved." And then he turned his horse and rode off down the long approach, leaving Lillian standing in the yard with her heart hammering, and the laundry, forgotten, half-pinned, flapping in the wind behind her. She told Luke everything the moment he returned that evening, watching his face go through a slow transformation from tired good humor to something hard and cold and dangerous as she recounted Sinclair's visit word for word. "He threatened you." Luke's voice had gone very quiet, which she was learning meant something worse than shouting would have. "Directly." Not directly. He was careful. Everything he said could be explained away as concern as a reasonable business offer, but I understood him, Luke. He meant every word as a threat. "I'll ride into town tomorrow. Talk to the sheriff again." He said something else. Lillian hesitated, then pushed forward because she'd promised herself she'd rather know hard truths than be protected from them, and she suspected Luke needed to hear this, even if it cost him something to hear it. "He offered me a position in his household. Said if things went poorly for you, he'd hate to see me caught in the wreckage." Luke's expression went utterly still, dangerously still, and when he spoke, his voice carried a coldness Lillian hadn't heard from him before. "He's trying to peel you away from me," he said. "Make you think your safety depends on distancing yourself from this fight. It's the same thing he tried with the Delacroix family before he ran them off their land. Isolate people, make them feel like staying loyal costs more than it's worth." "It won't work," Lillian said, and was surprised by her own certainty. "I don't frighten as easily as he seems to think." Something in Luke's face shifted, then softened at the edges, even as the anger stayed banked underneath. "No," he said slowly. "I'm starting to understand that about you." He looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, heavier than it had been even during their conversation about Sarah. "I need you to understand something, Lillian. This isn't your fight. You came here running from your own disaster, and I won't hold it against you if you decide Sinclair's threats are reason enough to leave. That train's still coming in 10 days. I'd put you on it myself, no hard feelings if that's what you wanted." "Is that what you want?" she asked. "For me to leave?" "No." The word came out fast, almost too fast, like he'd surprised himself with the honesty of it. He recovered, cleared his throat, pulled the careful practicality back over himself like a coat. "No, I think this house runs better with you in it. That's a plain fact, nothing more." But Lillian, watching his face in the lamplight, thought perhaps it was quite a bit more than that, even if neither of them was ready to say so plainly. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not because of Sinclair, and not because the train's coming. I'm staying because I choose to, and I'll thank you not to try talking me out of my own decisions, Mr. Garrett." "Luke," he corrected again, and this time there was warmth threaded through the correction that hadn't been there before. "Luke," she agreed. George. The following days brought no further visits from Sinclair, but the quiet felt loaded rather than peaceful, the kind of stillness that precedes weather rather than the kind that signals its absence. Silas grew watchful in a way Lillian hadn't seen before, keeping his rifle within reach even during ordinary chores. Boone stopped venturing far from the house alone. Luke rode the fence lines twice daily, instead of once checking for damage with a thoroughness that spoke louder than any words about how seriously he was taking Sinclair's implied threats. Then, 6 days after Sinclair's visit, disaster arrived in the middle of the night. Lillian woke to the smell of smoke and Boone's voice shouting from the yard, raw with panic, and by the time she'd thrown on her coat and reached the door, the sky beyond the barn had gone orange flames climbing fast against the dark, and Luke was already running toward it in nothing but his shirt sleeves, Silas close behind with buckets. "The hay store!" Luke shouted. "If it reaches the hay store, we lose the whole barn, maybe the stock too." "Lillian, get water, anything that'll hold water now." She ran. She didn't remember later exactly how she'd managed it, hauling buckets from the well, passing them hand to hand in a desperate chain with Boone and Silas, while Luke fought closer to the flames than any of them beating at burning hay with a wet blanket, his face lit orange and grim, with an intensity that frightened her more than the fire itself. It took nearly an hour to bring it under control, an hour that felt like a lifetime, and when the last of the flames finally guttered out into smoking ruin, Luke stood in the wreckage of half his barn, soot-streaked and breathing hard, staring at what remained with an expression Lillian couldn't read at all. "Anyone hurt?" His voice came out rough, scraped raw from smoke. "No, boss," Silas said. "Lost maybe a third of the hay store. Could have been worse. Could have been a lot worse." Luke agreed grimly, and then his eyes found Lillian's across the ruined yard, and something passed between them that needed no words, both of them understanding, without having to say it aloud, exactly who was responsible for this, even without a shred of proof that would satisfy a sheriff or a courtroom. "This wasn't an accident," Lillian said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "No," Luke agreed. "It wasn't." He looked down at his hands blackened with soot, and something in his jaw tightened with a fury he was visibly working to control. "Sinclair's done pushing with words. He's moved to pushing with fire. What happens now?" Luke turned to look at her, and in the gray light before dawn, exhausted and soot-covered and furious, he looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier, the weight of everything he was carrying suddenly visible in a way it usually wasn't. "Now," he said, "I stopped being patient with Howard Sinclair." He didn't elaborate further that night, too exhausted, too raw with anger to explain what he meant, but Lillian understood, watching him stare out at the smoking ruin of his barn, with his fists clenched at his sides, that whatever line Sinclair had just crossed had changed something fundamental in the fight between them, had transformed it from a quiet standoff of offers and refusals into something with real teeth, real danger, and no guarantee at all of how it would end. She thought of Sinclair's smile in the yard, cold and practiced. A young woman alone, no family in this territory, entangled in another man's troubles. She had told him she didn't frighten easily. Standing in the smoking wreckage of a barn that had nearly killed the men she'd come to care for, watching Luke Garrett's jaw tighten with a fury, she understood he'd been holding back for years. Lillian Foster discovered that fear and resolve could occupy the same space in a person's chest without canceling each other out, and that whatever came next, Whatever danger Howard Sinclair intended to bring to the Double Circle Ranch, she had no intention of running from it. Morning light found the barn still smoking in places, thin gray ribbons curling up from blackened timber, and Luke stood surveying the damage with Silas, while Lillian brought coffee out to both of them, her hands still faintly trembling from a night that had stretched her nerves thinner than she'd known they could go. "We'll need lumber," Silas said, running a hand along a charred support beam. "This side's not salvageable. Maybe 2 weeks to rebuild proper if the weather holds." 2 weeks we don't have to spare with Roundup coming," Luke said, but there was no real complaint in it, just tired arithmetic. He took the coffee Lillian offered his fingers, brushing hers for just a moment longer than necessary, and something passed between them that neither acknowledged aloud. "I'm riding into town," he said. "Talking to Sheriff Combs again. Formally this time with you and Boone as witnesses to Sinclair's visit, and his exact words." "Will it matter?" Lillian asked. "You said yourself he never touches anything directly." "It might not matter today, but I want it on record. I want a paper trail that says Howard Sinclair threatened this ranch before the fire happened in case—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "In case it gets worse," Lillian finished quietly. "In case it gets worse," Luke agreed. They rode into Promise Creek together that afternoon, Lillian seated beside him in the wagon with Boone trailing on horseback, and the town felt different to her now than it had 3 weeks earlier. No longer simply the place that had abandoned her on a platform, but a place with its own currents of danger running beneath the ordinary business of storefronts and dusty streets. Sheriff Combs turned out to be a heavy-set man with kind eyes and a weariness that suggested he'd spent years watching problems he couldn't quite solve. He listened to Lillian's account of Sinclair's visit with careful attention, writing notes in a battered ledger, but his expression remained cautious throughout. "I believe you, Miss Foster," he said when she'd finished. "Every word of it. But belief and proof are different animals in a court of law. Sinclair's smart. He never says a thing that couldn't be explained as a businessman's ordinary concern. A fire with no witness to who set it a threat, that's really just an offer with a shadow behind it. None of that holds up if I bring charges." "So he simply continues," Luke said, flat with frustration. "Burns another barn, makes another threat, and there's nothing to be done because he's careful enough to leave no fingerprints." "I didn't say nothing," Combs said. "I said I need more than what you've brought me today. Witnesses who will testify to what they've seen him do, not just what he said. Financial records if you can get them showing the pattern with the Delacroix place and others like it. Build me a case with real teeth, and I'll move on it, Garrett. You have my word." It wasn't the resolution either of them wanted, but it was something, and they rode back toward the Double Circle with a plan beginning to take shape between them. Luke would ride out to speak with the Delacroix family, if he could find where they'd settled after losing their land, and see what they might be willing to say on record about how Sinclair had forced their hand. "I'll come with you," Lillian said. "It might be dangerous." "Everything here seems to be dangerous lately, Luke. I'd rather face it beside you than wait at the house wondering." He glanced at her, something warm and complicated moving behind his eyes. "All right," he said. "Together then." Tayit. They found the Delacroix family 2 days later, settled in a cramped rented house on the edge of a neighboring town, and the difference between the confident rancher's daughter Lillian had heard described in Promise Creek gossip and the tired guarded woman who answered the door was stark enough to make her chest ache with recognition. "Mrs. Delacroix." Luke removed his hat. "I'm Luke Garrett from the Double Circle out past Promise Creek. I wondered if we might speak with you about Howard Sinclair." The woman's face went carefully blank at the name, and for a moment, Lillian thought she would simply close the door on them. "We don't discuss that business," she said. "Not with strangers." "I'm not a stranger to what he does," Luke said quietly. "He's trying the same thing on my land now. Fires, threats, offers dressed up as kindness. I need to know what happened to you, Mrs. Delacroix, because I think it might be the only thing that stops him from doing it to someone else." Something shifted in the woman's expression. Recognition, maybe, or the particular exhaustion of someone who has carried a secret too long and finally been offered a reason to set it down. "Come in," she said. quickly before the neighbors take notice. Inside over weak tea served in mismatched cups, Amelia Delacroix told them a story that made Lillian's stomach turn cold with dread. Sinclair had approached her husband 2 years earlier with an offer to consolidate a small debt into a more manageable loan. Friendly, reasonable seeming, exactly the kind of help a struggling rancher might welcome. The terms seemed fair at first, Amelia said, hands wrapped tight around her cup. But he'd buried clauses in that contract my husband didn't understand, terms that let him call the full debt due without warning all at once if we missed even a single payment by so much as a week. And then once we'd signed, the trouble started. Cattle going missing. A well poisoned, though we never proved it was deliberate. Then a payment envelope that simply never arrived, though my husband swore he'd sent it on time, and suddenly Sinclair was standing in our parlor with his lawyer calling the entire loan due within 30 days. You couldn't pay it, Luke said. Of course we couldn't. No one could on 30 days' notice, not after 2 years of him bleeding us dry with unfortunate coincidences. Amelia's voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth for a moment before continuing. He offered to buy the land instead. Forgive the debt entirely, he said, generous as anything, if we simply signed the deed over. We had no choice. We had 2 children, and no other way to discharge that debt. Would you testify to this? Lillian asked gently. To the sheriff on record, it might be the only way to stop him doing this again. Amelia's face went pale with fear. He'd ruin us further. He has men who watch for him, who report back everything. If word got to him that we'd spoken, you'd have Sheriff Combs' protection, Luke said. And mine. I know what it costs to speak up against a man like Sinclair, but I also know what it costs everyone else if no one ever does. Amelia was quiet a long moment, looking between them, and finally she nodded, slow and reluctant. I'll speak to your sheriff. Not today. I need to speak with my husband first. Prepare him for what it might cost us. But I'll speak. It was a small victory, fragile and uncertain, but Lillian felt something loosen in her chest as they rode back toward Promise Creek that evening, the first real crack in Sinclair's careful armor of deniability. She did not yet know how quickly that crack would be discovered, or how viciously Sinclair would move to seal it back shut. The trouble arrived 4 days later, and it arrived in a form neither of them had anticipated. Lillian was in the kitchen kneading bread dough with the particular fierce concentration she'd learned to bring to ordinary tasks whenever her mind wanted to spiral toward worry, when Boone burst through the door, breathless, his face white with alarm. Ma'am, Miss Foster, there's men out on the north fence line cutting wire, and Silas is trying to hold them off alone, and Luke's gone into town for supplies, and I don't know what to. How many men? 3 that I saw. Could be more. Lillian's mind moved fast, some old instinct from a life of managing crises with limited resources kicking into gear. Ride for the Sheriff Boone. Now as fast as your horse will carry you. I'll go to Silas. Ma'am, that's not safe. Neither is leaving Silas alone against 3 armed men. Go, Boone. I'll be careful. She took Luke's rifle down from above the mantel, with hands that shook only slightly, checked it, the way he'd shown her 3 days earlier during an afternoon lesson she'd insisted on after the barn fire, and rode out toward the north fence, with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She found Silas pinned behind a rock outcropping, his own rifle raised, shouting something at 3 men working fast to cut through the fence wire, while a 4th held horses at a distance, and the scene resolved itself into terrifying clarity as she approached. These weren't simply vandals. They were driving Luke's cattle deliberately toward the cut fence line, toward open range, where a scattered herd might take weeks to fully recover, might wander into ravines, might be lost entirely to a rustler's opportunity in the chaos. Get back, girl, this ain't your fight, Silas shouted as she reined up beside him. It's exactly my fight, Lillian said, and raised the rifle, firing once into the air, the crack of it splitting the afternoon wide open. The men startled whirled, and for one terrifying moment, Lillian thought she'd simply provoked worse violence rather than deterring any. But then one of them called out to the others something about not part of the job description shooting women, and they began falling back toward their horses, cursing, abandoning the half-cut fence line. You'll regret that, one of them called out, as he mounted his face just visible enough for Lillian to memorize a scarred jaw, a missing front tooth details she filed away with grim purpose. "Tell Garrett this is just the beginning." They rode off in a cloud of dust, and Lillian sat trembling on her horse, the rifle still raised until Silas finally reached out and gently pushed the barrel down toward the earth. "You did good," he said, his voice rough with something like wonder. "Real good, Miss Foster. Boss is going to have plenty to say about you riding out here alone, though." "Boss can say whatever he likes," Lillian said, her voice shaking only slightly now that the danger had passed. "I wasn't going to sit in that kitchen waiting to hear whether you'd survived." Luke arrived 20 minutes later, having passed Boone on the road, and turned back immediately, and the look on his face when he found Lillian still mounted, still holding the rifle, still white-faced but unhurt, was something Lillian would remember for the rest of her life. Terror and relief and fury, all tangled together, raw and unguarded in a way she'd never seen from him before. "You could have been killed," he said, swinging down from his horse. Fast, crossing to her, his hands coming up to grip her arms like he needed to confirm with his own touch that she was truly unharmed. "3 armed men, Lillian and you, rode out here with nothing but, with enough sense to fire a warning shot and enough courage not to let Silas face 3 men alone," Lillian said, meeting his eyes steadily despite the tremor still running through her. "I wasn't reckless, Luke. I was necessary." Something in his face cracked open, then some careful control finally giving way, and before either of them fully registered what was happening, his hands had moved from her arms to cup her face, and he was looking at her with an intensity that stole the breath from her chest. "I can't lose anyone else," he said low and rough. "Not like I lost Sarah. Not like I've spent 6 years afraid of losing anyone I let matter to me again. And you." He stopped himself, visibly wrestling with words he hadn't intended to say aloud. "You matter, Lillian. More than I've let myself admit." The words hung between them in the fading afternoon light, and Lillian felt her heart seize with something that was equal parts terror and hope. 6 years of grief and careful distance suddenly cracking open in front of her, and she understood with sudden clarity that whatever she felt stirring in her own chest was no longer simple gratitude or growing friendship. "Luke," she started. "Boss!" Silas's voice cut through the moment, urgent. "Sheriff's coming up the road, and he's got the Delacroix woman with him. Says it's urgent." Luke's hands dropped away from her face, the moment fracturing, and both of them turned to see Sheriff Combs' wagon approaching fast. Amelia Delacroix, seated beside him, her face tight with fear. Garrett, Combs called, drawing up. "We've got a problem. Word's already reached Sinclair that Mrs. Delacroix visited you. Man's got eyes everywhere in this county, more than I realized. He's threatening to call in every note he holds on her husband's remaining debts unless she recants whatever she told you." "That's extortion," Luke said, fury replacing the tenderness that had been in his voice moments before. "Plain and simple. It's exactly that," Combs agreed grimly. "But proving it in a way that'll hold up is still the trouble. I need more Garrett. I need something that ties Sinclair directly to the fire, to the fence cutting today, to something beyond implication and coincidence." 3 men cut my fence and drove cattle toward open range not 2 hours ago," Silas said. "Miss Foster here got a good look at one of them, scarred jaw, missing front tooth." Combs' expression sharpened with sudden interest. "Scarred jaw, you say?" "Yes," Lillian confirmed. "Why?" "Because that description matches a man named Cole Hardy, known troublemaker, done time for assault. And I happen to know for a fact he's been seen drinking at Sinclair's expense in the saloon more than once these past months." Combs' jaw set with grim satisfaction. "That's not proof yet, but it's a thread. And if we can find someone willing to say they saw Hardy taking orders directly from Sinclair, we might have enough to move." "I'll find that someone," Luke said. "If it exists, I'll find it." "Be careful how you go about it," Combs warned. "Sinclair's dangerous precisely because he's careful. Push too hard too fast, and you might force his hand toward something worse than fires and cut fences." The warning settled over the group like a shadow, and Lillian felt the fragile hope of the afternoon, Luke's hands on her face, his unfinished words recede beneath the weight of a danger that was only growing more urgent, more personal with every passing day. That night, after Combs and Amelia had departed and the ranch had settled into an uneasy quiet, Lillian found Luke on the porch again, staring out at the mended fence line, visible in the moonlight, his expression heavy with worry. "You never finished what you were saying," she said, settling beside him. Before the sheriff arrived, Luke was quiet a long moment, and Lillian watched him wrestle visibly with whatever wanted to be said, the same careful control she'd witnessed since their first conversation on this very porch 3 weeks ago. "I told myself after Sarah that I wasn't built to risk that kind of loss again," he said finally. "I built this ranch instead, poured everything into land and cattle and fence lines because land doesn't leave you the way people do. Land doesn't take fever in the winter and die 11 days later while you're still telling yourself there's time to wait. And now there's a woman in my kitchen who rode out alone today to face 3 armed men because she wouldn't let my foreman stand alone against them, and I find myself more afraid of something happening to her than I've been afraid of anything since I buried Sarah." He turned to look at her fully moonlight, catching the raw honesty in his expression. "I don't know what to do with that fear, Lillian. I've spent 6 years making sure I'd never have to feel it again. Maybe," Lillian said carefully, "the answer isn't avoiding the fear. Maybe it's deciding whether what causes it is worth the risk." "Is it?" Luke asked, and the question carried weight far beyond its simple syllables. Worth the risk. Lillian thought of Ethan Wallace's letters, every beautiful promise curdled into lies. She thought of a station master's tired pity of $6 and a return ticket she no longer wanted to use. She thought of 3 weeks that had rewritten her entire understanding of what safety and belonging might look like, built not on romantic promises, but on shared work, hard truths, honestly spoken, and a man who had never once in all his careful restraint made her feel like anything less than an equal partner in whatever came next. "I think," she said slowly, "that the things worth having are rarely the safe ones. I think I crossed 1,000 miles chasing a safe arrangement built on lies and found something far more frightening and far more real waiting for me instead." Luke's hand found hers in the darkness, and neither of them pulled away. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Sinclair, the danger, none of it's finished. I won't pretend otherwise, not even tonight." "I know," Lillian said. "I'm not asking you to pretend. But whatever comes," Luke continued, his thumb tracing slow, absent circles against her palm, "I don't want to face it pretending I don't feel what I feel for you either. That seems like its own kind of cowardice, and I've had enough cowardice from myself these 6 years to last a lifetime." "What do you feel, Luke?" He turned to face her fully then, and in the moonlight, his expression held none of its usual careful reserve, stripped down to something raw and honest and frightened and hopeful all at once. "I feel like maybe I've been waiting for you longer than either of us realized," he said. "Since before you ever stepped off that train." The words echoed his first words to her on the platform 3 weeks earlier, but they landed entirely differently now. No longer a stranger's strange observation, but something closer to confession, and Lillian felt her heart swell with an emotion so large it frightened her nearly as much as Sinclair's threats had. She didn't answer with words. She answered by closing the distance between them, and when Luke Garrett kissed her for the first time on that moonlit porch, careful and searching, and full of 6 years of buried grief, finally daring to reach toward something like hope. Again, Lillian understood that whatever else Promise Creek had taken from her, it had given her something infinitely more valuable in return. But even as she leaned into that kiss, some cold, watchful part of her mind registered the sound of a horse in the far distance, moving away from the ranch rather than toward it, and she wondered with a chill that cut straight through the warmth of the moment. How long Howard Sinclair's eyes had been watching this porch, and what price they would both pay for the tenderness they'd finally allowed themselves tonight. The horse's hoofbeats faded into silence, and Lillian pulled back from the kiss with her pulse still racing, though now for a different reason than tenderness. "Someone was out there," she said. "Watching." Luke's expression shifted instantly, the softness draining away, replaced by the same hard watchfulness she'd seen in him since the fire. "You're certain?" "I heard a horse. Moving away, not toward us. If it was one of Sinclair's men, then he knows exactly what he saw tonight." Luke stood fast, scanning the dark tree line beyond the yard, his hand dropping instinctively to where his sidearm usually hung, finding nothing there since he'd left it inside for the evening. "Get inside, Lillian. Now." She didn't argue. Whatever had bloomed between them on the porch moments earlier now felt fragile against the sudden reassertion of danger, and she followed him inside where he bolted the door and moved immediately to check the windows, methodical and grim. "You think he'll use this against us?" Lillian said. It wasn't a question. "I think Howard Sinclair uses everything against everyone eventually." Luke ran a hand through his hair, frustration and worry warring on his face. If he knows what's between us now, he'll see it as another lever to pull, another way to hurt me by threatening you. "I'm not afraid of him. I know you're not. That's what worries me." Luke turned to face her fully, the lamplight throwing half his face into shadow. "Sinclair doesn't need you to be afraid, Lillian. He just needs you to be vulnerable, and being close to me makes you vulnerable whether you're afraid or not. Then what would you have me do? Pretend distance I don't feel, pack my things, and take the next train after all?" The words came out sharper than she intended. Old fear resurfacing, fear of being sent away again, abandoned again. This time not by a con man's lies, but by a good man's misguided protectiveness. "I told you once already. Luke Garrett, I don't frighten easily, and I won't be managed like a problem to be solved." Something in Luke's face softened, chastened. "That's not what I meant." "Then say what you meant." "I meant that I'm afraid," he said quietly, "of loving someone again, and watching this town, this county, this man take her from me the way it's taken everything else I've ever cared about." His voice cracked slightly on the word loving, like it cost him something enormous to say it aloud. "I meant that 6 years of careful distance suddenly feels like nothing against how much I already can't imagine this house without you in it." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded, and Lillian felt her anger dissolve into something gentler, more urgent. "Then we face it together," she said. "Not with distance. Not with you trying to protect me by pushing me away. Together, Luke, or not at all." He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, and this time, the kiss carried less searching tenderness and more fierce, desperate need. Two people choosing each other in full knowledge of the danger that choice invited. Morning brought Silas to the door before dawn, his face grim, and the words he carried confirmed exactly what both of them had feared. "Boss, you need to see this." They followed him out to the east pasture where 6 of Luke's best breeding cattle lay dead in the grass. Not from disease or accident, but from what Silas's careful examination revealed to be poison deliberately placed in a trough far enough from the main herd to seem almost accidental, if not for the pattern now undeniably forming. "That's near $400 in stock gone in a single night," Luke said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "And it's a message. He wants me to know he can reach anywhere on this land he pleases." "There's something else." Silas held out a folded paper found weighted down with a stone near the poisoned trough. "This was left where we'd be sure to find it." Luke unfolded it, and Lillian watched his face harden into something colder than she'd yet seen from him as he read the few brief lines aloud. "Garrett 6 cattle today. Consider it a demonstration of what's possible. My offer expires in 1 week. Sell or watch everything you've built disappear piece by piece, including the things you've only recently decided to value. HS." "He knows," Lillian said quietly, "about us. He's threatening you directly now. Not implied, not deniable, threatening you outright." Luke's hand crumpled the paper in his fist. "This changes things. This is enough for Combs to move on, isn't it? A written threat signed with his own initials?" "It might be," Lillian said carefully, "but men like Sinclair are careful even in their carelessness. He'll have some explanation ready, a joke taken out of context, a misunderstanding. We need more than this single note." "Then we get more." Luke's jaw set with grim determination. "Silas ride for Combs. Tell him about the cattle, show him this note. Boone, I want you riding the fence line every 2 hours from now until this is settled. I won't lose more stock to a man too cowardly to face me directly." As the men dispersed to their tasks, Luke turned to Lillian, and something in his expression had shifted overnight, hardened into a resolve she hadn't seen from him before. "I'm done being patient," he said. "Done waiting for proof to fall into our laps, while Sinclair picks apart everything I've built, one poisoned trough, one cut fence at a time. I'm going to find whoever's willing to talk Hardy or someone else in Sinclair's employ who's grown tired of doing his dirty work without proper pay or protection. Let me help." "Lillian, you said it yourself, Luke, together or not at all. I meant that as much as you did." She met his eyes steadily. "I have a mind for this kind of work. I managed my mother's household accounts for years, untangled worse financial confusion than whatever Sinclair thinks he's hidden. Let me look at whatever records we can gather. Let me help build the case against him properly, instead of sitting in the kitchen waiting to hear whether you've survived another confrontation." Luke studied her for a long moment, something like pride mixing with his worry. "All right," he said finally. "Together." It took 4 days of careful, dangerous work to build what they needed. Luke rode to 3 neighboring ranches whose owners had also received Sinclair's generous offers, gathering quiet testimonies from men too frightened to speak publicly, but willing to sign private statements once they understood others had already begun to break the silence around him. Lillian spent long hours poring over the county land records at the courthouse, cross-referencing purchase dates and mortgage filings with newspaper archives, building a timeline that showed with damning clarity exactly how many families had lost their land to Sinclair in the 2 years since Luke's father had died, each sale following the same pattern of small debts, calling due unexpectedly, of accidents and coincidences preceding each capitulation. "Look at this," she said one evening, spreading her notes across the kitchen table for Luke and Silas to examine. 7 ranches in 2 years, all following an identical pattern. Debt consolidation offered as a kindness followed within months by some crisis fire-poisoned stock, cut fences missing payments the owners swear they sent, followed by Sinclair's generous offer to purchase the land outright and forgive the remaining debt. 7 ranches, Luke repeated, staring at the paper. "That's not coincidence. That's a system." "It's a system with your name next in line," Lillian said. "But it's also a system with a paper trail now, if Combs can get even 2 or 3 of these families to testify formally alongside Amelia Delacroix." "I'll ride out tomorrow," Luke said. "Show this to Combs directly, see if it's enough to move him toward real action." But the following morning brought a complication neither of them had anticipated. Boone came pounding up to the house before sunrise, his horse lathered with hard riding, his face white with alarm that Lillian recognized instantly as worse than anything they'd faced yet. "Boss, it's Amelia Delacroix. Someone rode into her town last night and burned down the rented house where she and her family were staying. She's alive, her husband's alive, but their youngest boy took smoke in his lungs bad, and the doctor's not certain he'll pull through." The blood drained from Lillian's face. "That's a child, Luke. He's threatening a child now." "He's not threatening," Luke said, his voice gone terrifyingly quiet, the same controlled fury she'd seen the night of the barn fire, but colder now, harder. "He's escalated past threats entirely. This is attempted murder, Boone, whatever excuse he dresses it up in." "Sheriff Combs is already there," Boone said. "Sent me to fetch you directly. Says he needs to see you and Miss Foster, both urgent." They rode hard for the neighboring town, Lillian's mind churning with horror and fury in equal measure, and found Sheriff Combs standing outside the smoking ruin of the Delacroix rental house, his face grim in a way that suggested even his considerable patience had finally reached its limit. "Boy's at the doctor's now," Combs said without preamble. "Might live, might not. Doctor won't say for certain either way. Amelia's husband is fit to be tied. Wants to ride out to Sinclair's place himself with a shotgun. And honestly, Garrett, I understand the impulse more than I'd like to admit." "Is this enough?" Luke asked. "A child nearly killed, is this finally enough to move against him?" "It's enough for me to want to," Combs said. "Whether it's enough to hold up depends on whether we can prove Sinclair ordered it, same problem as always." He rubbed a hand over his tired face. "But something's changed. Man who'd order a house burned with children inside is a man who stopped being careful. Desperate men make mistakes, Garrett. I intend to be watching close for his. That evening, with the Delacroix boys' condition still uncertain and the whole county now buzzing with fear and outrage over Sinclair's escalation, Lillian sat with Luke on the porch that had witnessed their first kiss just days earlier and felt the weight of everything pressing down on both of them. "This is because of us," she said quietly. "Because we went to Amelia because we're building a case against him. That child is fighting for his life because we asked his mother to speak the truth." "No." Luke's voice was firm, immediate. "That child is fighting for his life because Howard Sinclair is a monster who'd rather burn down a house with children in it than lose an ounce of the power he's built through fear. You didn't do this, Lillian. He did. I know that with my mind. My heart's having more trouble with it." Luke took her hand, held it steady in both of his. "Then let your mind lead for now. We're closer to stopping him than we've ever been. If we stop now out of fear of what he might do next, we're only guaranteeing he keeps doing it to someone else." Lillian thought of the pattern she'd traced through county records. 7 ranches, 7 families, each one broken piece by piece by a man who'd learned exactly how to hurt people without ever leaving fingerprints. She thought of a small boy fighting for breath in a doctor's office because his mother had found the courage to speak. "We finish this," she said, "whatever it costs." The break came unexpectedly from Cole Hardy himself, the scarred jaw man Lillian had faced down at the fence line weeks earlier, who arrived at the double circle 3 days later, under cover of darkness, looking nothing like the confident thug who'd threatened her that afternoon, and everything like a frightened man who'd finally understood the true depth of what he'd been party to. "I want to talk," he said when Luke answered the door with rifle in hand, wary of a trick. "About Sinclair, about everything." They brought him inside cautiously, and over the following hour, Hardy told a story that filled in every gap Lillian's careful research had left open. Sinclair had personally ordered the fire at the Delacroix house, had personally ordered the poisoning of Luke's cattle, had personally directed every act of sabotage across 7 different ranches over 2 years, always through intermediaries, always with careful instructions to leave no trace back to himself. "Why are you telling us this now?" Luke asked. "You've done his dirty work for months without conscience troubling you." Hardy's face twisted with something like shame. "A child, Garrett. I signed on for scaring folks, breaking fences, maybe roughing up cattle. Nobody told me it had come to burning a house with children sleeping in it. I didn't set that fire myself, but I knew the men who did, and I can't sleep knowing what almost happened because I stayed quiet about everything before it. Would you testify to this formally before Sheriff Combs? He'll kill me if he finds out." "He might," Luke said honestly. "Or Combs can arrange protection, get you moved somewhere safe until this is settled in court. But if you stay silent, Hardy, you're complicit in whatever he does next. That's a weight I don't think you want to keep carrying." Hardy sat with that a long moment, his scarred jaw working, and finally nodded slow and resigned. "I'll talk. God help me, I'll talk." They rode for Sheriff Combs that same night, and by dawn, with Hardy's formal statement in hand alongside Lillian's careful documentation of the pattern across 7 ranches, and Amelia Delacroix's own testimony finally secured, now that her son's condition had stabilized, Combs declared with grim satisfaction that they finally had enough. "I'll ride for the circuit judge myself," he said. "Get a warrant for Sinclair's arrest, seize his financial records before he has time to destroy them. This is enough, Garrett. This is finally enough." But even as relief began to unspool through Lillian's chest, a cold thought settled alongside it. A man as careful as ruthless as Howard Sinclair would not simply wait quietly to be arrested. Desperate men made mistakes, Combs had said. But desperate men also sometimes made one final catastrophic move before going down. That night, riding back toward the double circle in the darkness, Lillian voiced the fear aloud. "He'll know by tomorrow that Hardy's talked, that the warrant's coming." "He will," Luke agreed grimly. "What does a man like that do, Luke, when he realizes everything he's built is about to collapse?" Luke's hands tightened on the reins, his profile hard against the starlit sky. "He does something desperate," he said. "Something final. The words hung in the cold night air between them, heavy with foreboding, and Lillian felt the fragile peace of the past few days curdle back into the same watchful fear that had shadowed every step of her time at the Double Circle Ranch. Because whatever Howard Sinclair intended to do next, she understood with sickening certainty that it would not be a small thing, and it would not be gentle, and it would very likely come for the two things he now knew mattered most to Luke Garrett: his land and the woman standing beside him. They reached the Double Circle just before dawn, and Luke wasted no time organizing what defense he could. Silas and Boone armed and posted at opposite ends of the property. Extra ammunition laid out on the kitchen table, every door and window checked twice for solid latches. "You should go into town," Luke said. "Stay with Combs somewhere safe until this is settled." "No." Lillian's answer came without hesitation. "I told you already, Luke. I'm not leaving because things have gotten frightening. I've spent my whole life being told to step back to let others handle what's hard. I won't do it now, not with everything we've built these past weeks on the line. This isn't about proving your courage. This is about keeping you alive. And I intend to stay alive right here fighting beside you." She met his eyes steady, despite the fear coiled tight in her chest. "You said it yourself once together, or not at all. I meant it then. I mean it more now." Luke studied her for a long moment, some internal battle playing out behind his eyes, and finally he nodded, pulling her close for one fierce brief embrace before releasing her to check the rifle she'd learned to handle with growing confidence over the past weeks. "Then we do this together," he said. "But you stay near the house. Promise me that much." "I promise." The day passed in agonizing tension, every distant sound sending fresh adrenaline through Lillian's veins, every hour without incident, somehow worse than open confrontation would have been. By late afternoon, word arrived via a rider Combs had sent ahead. The circuit judge had granted the warrant. Sinclair's arrest was authorized. Combs and two deputies were riding for the bank that very evening to take him into custody. "It's over," Boone said, relief evident in his young face. "Ain't it, boss? They're arresting him tonight." "It's not over until he's actually behind bars," Luke said grimly. "A man like Sinclair doesn't go quietly, and he's had all day to hear whispers that his time's running out. He was right to be cautious." Barely an hour later, as the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains, Silas came running from his post at the north fence, breathless and urgent. "Riders coming, boss. 6, maybe 7. Coming fast, and they ain't wearing badges." Luke's face went hard and cold. "Positions, everyone. Now." Lillian's heart hammered as she took up the position Luke had assigned her inside the house near the front window, rifle ready, watching the approach through gauze curtains, with hands that shook despite weeks of practice steadying her aim. This was different from the fence line confrontation weeks earlier. This felt final, felt like the culmination of everything that had been building since that first note weighted down with a stone. The riders came into view at the edge of the property, and at their head, unmistakable even at a distance, rode Howard Sinclair himself, no longer hiding behind intermediaries and careful deniability, but riding openly toward the Double Circle, with an expression of cold, furious desperation that confirmed everything Combs had predicted about desperate men making final moves. "Garrett." Sinclair's voice carried across the yard sharp, with barely controlled rage. "I know what you've done, Hardy, that traitor, and the Delacroix woman you've built your little case, haven't you, thinking you've won?" Luke stepped out onto the porch, rifle steady in his hands. Silas and Boone positioned at angles that gave them clear lines of sight without exposing themselves fully. "It's over, Sinclair. Combs has the warrant. Whatever you do here tonight only makes things worse for yourself. Worse." Sinclair's laugh carried an unhinged edge that made Lillian's skin crawl even through the window glass separating them. "I've spent 2 years building an empire in this valley, Garrett. 2 years, and you and that woman inside think you can dismantle it with a few signed statements and a frightened criminal's confession. I won't allow it. I'll burn this ranch to the ground before I let you hand me over to a judge." "You're outnumbered," Luke said, though Lillian could hear the tension underneath his controlled calm. 6 men against 3, and Combs is already riding for your bank with a warrant. Whatever happens here tonight, you're finished either way. Then I'll be finished having taken everything from you first." Sinclair's eyes cut toward the house, toward the window where Lillian stood watching, and something in his expression turned viciously personal. Starting with her. What happened next unfolded with the terrible speed of true crisis. Sinclair's men spurring their horses forward, Luke and Silas and Boone opening fire in coordinated defense, the afternoon shattering into chaos and noise, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Lillian threw herself flat as a shot shattered the window above her head, glass raining down across the floor, her heart pounding so hard she could barely think past the terror clawing up her throat. But underneath the terror, something else rose too. The same fierce resolve that had sent her riding out to the fence line weeks earlier, that had kept her documenting Sinclair's pattern of destruction, late into countless nights that had refused again and again to simply accept being a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She rose to a crouch, rifle in hand, and through the broken window caught sight of one of Sinclair's men circling toward the side of the house, clearly intending to breach it, while the main confrontation held everyone else's attention. Her hands were steady now, steadier than she'd expected, months of practice and desperate necessity, narrowing her focus to a single clear point. She fired once, aimed high and deliberate the way Luke had taught her, catching the man's shoulder, rather than anything more lethal, and watched him wheel his horse away with a shout of pain and surprise. "Lillian," Luke's voice raw with fear cutting through the chaos outside. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." One of them tried to flank the house. "He's retreating." The exchange of gunfire continued for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only minutes, and gradually Lillian became aware that the sound had shifted. Fewer shots, more shouting, and finally, blessedly, the unmistakable thunder of additional horses arriving fast from the direction of town. "Sheriff's men," Boone's voice exultant with relief. "Combs is here, Boss Combs and his deputies." The arrival of reinforcements broke what remained of Sinclair's resolve. Two of his men, already wounded, threw down their weapons at the sight of the approaching lawmen. Another wheeled his horse and fled outright, abandoning any loyalty to a cause that had clearly collapsed. Sinclair himself cornered now, his careful empire crumbling in real time before his eyes, made one last desperate lunge, not toward Luke, but toward the house itself, toward the window where he'd last seen Lillian standing, some final vicious impulse to destroy the thing he'd identified as Luke's greatest vulnerability. Lillian saw him coming and had only seconds to decide, and in those seconds, every ounce of fear she'd carried since that first night at the train station crystallized into something harder, more determined. She would not be a victim again. Not to a con man's abandonment, not to a banker's desperate cruelty, not to anyone who believed her survival was theirs to control. She raised the rifle as Sinclair burst through the already shattered window, his own weapon rising toward her, and the sound of her shot, and Luke's fired simultaneously from the porch, where he'd broken from his own confrontation the instant he'd seen Sinclair's horse turn toward the house, filled the small room with deafening finality. Sinclair crumpled, wounded but alive, his weapon clattering uselessly to the floor, and the sudden silence that followed felt almost more shocking than the chaos that had preceded it. Lillian. Luke was through the door in seconds, pulling her away from Sinclair's fallen form, his hands checking her frantically for injury, even as his eyes remained wary on the wounded man groaning on the floor. "Are you hurt? Tell me you're not hurt." "I'm not hurt," she said, and found her voice steadier than she'd expected, though her whole body trembled now that the immediate danger had passed. "I'm not hurt, Luke." Sheriff Combs arrived moments later, taking in the scene with grim efficiency. And within the hour, Howard Sinclair, wounded but stable, was in custody, along with 3 of his surviving men, the remaining 2 having fled into the hills, where Combs assured them pursuit would follow at first light. "It's over," Combs said, standing in the wreckage of the front room, surveying the shattered window and scattered glass with weary satisfaction. "Really over this time. With the shooting tonight, with Hardy's testimony, with everything Miss Foster documented about the pattern across 7 ranches Sinclair's finished Garrett. There's no talking his way out of this." The following days brought a strange, exhausted peace to the double circle, the kind that settles after a long fever finally breaks. Word spread fast through Promise Creek, And beyond Howard Sinclair's arrest, his confession under the weight of overwhelming evidence, his admission not only to the crimes against Luke's ranch, but to the systematic destruction of 7 families across 2 years, motivated by nothing more than pure calculating greed. The Delacroix family's stolen land was returned to them by court order, their debt forgiven entirely once the fraudulent nature of Sinclair's original loan terms came to light. 5 other families received similar restitution, their years of quiet suffering finally acknowledged, and as much as money could manage, repaired. The Delacroix boy, Lillian learned with profound relief, made a full recovery from the smoke that had nearly claimed his young life. His mother's courage in speaking the truth, ultimately proving to be the thread that unraveled Sinclair's entire criminal enterprise. Cole Hardy, in recognition of his cooperation, received a reduced sentence and a genuine chance at rebuilding an honest life. Something Lillian found herself unexpectedly glad of, remembering the shame that had driven him to finally break his silence. And at the Double Circle Ranch, in the quiet aftermath of danger, finally passed. Garrett found Lillian Foster sitting on the porch steps one evening, watching the sun set gold and orange over mountains that had, in the space of 2 extraordinary months, become as familiar to her as Boston's streets had once been. "I keep thinking about that first night," she said as he settled beside her. "Standing on that platform, certain my whole life had just fallen apart because Ethan Wallace never showed. And now I think perhaps it was the only way I'd ever have found this instead." She turned to look at him, at the man who had offered her honest work, instead of false promises, who had shown her day by day what it looked like when someone's actions matched their words. "I was so angry at him for so long, for abandoning me, for making me feel worthless enough to be left behind without explanation. But if he hadn't, you'd never have been standing on that platform when I came looking," Luke finished quietly. "I'd never have found any of this. You, Silas and Boone, this land, a life built on something real instead of letters full of pretty lies." She reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation, their fingers lacing together with the easy familiarity of 2 people who had weathered genuine crisis and come through it stronger rather than broken. "I think I understand now what you meant that first night, when you said I'd been waiting for you. What do you think I meant? I think you meant that some part of both of us was waiting for exactly this. Not the danger, not the fear, but the choosing. The decision to build something honest with someone who sees you clearly and stays anyway." She smiled, something soft and certain settling over her features. "I wasn't looking for a husband when I left Boston, Luke. I was looking for survival, but somewhere along the way, without either of us quite noticing when it happened, I found something I never knew to hope for." Luke's thumb traced slow circles against her palm, his expression carrying none of the careful reserve she'd first encountered on that dusty platform 2 months earlier. "I spent 6 years telling myself I wasn't built for this," he said. "That loving someone again meant risking a loss I couldn't survive twice. But watching you these past weeks, watching you face down armed men and poisoned cattle and every threat Sinclair could throw at us without once backing down, I understood something I'd been too afraid to admit before." "What's that?" "That the risk was never the problem. The problem was, I'd convinced myself safety mattered more than living fully, more than loving fully, even when the person worth loving was standing right in front of me." He turned to face her, fully moonlight beginning to silver the edges of the darkening sky. "I don't want careful anymore, Lillian. I don't want distance, or provisional arrangements, or waiting to see if the danger's truly past before I let myself say what I mean." "Then say it," Lillian whispered. "I love you." Luke said, simple and unadorned, exactly the way he said everything that mattered most. "Not because you needed rescuing, and not because I needed a housekeeper. I love you because you rode out to face 3 armed men rather than let Silas stand alone. Because you spent countless nights poring over county records until your eyes ached, building a case that ultimately saved 7 families from ruin. Because you looked at everything frightening about this life and chose to stay anyway, not out of desperation, but out of genuine will." Tears gathered in Lillian's eyes, warm and unexpected joy, so profound it ached in her chest. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have for weeks now, though I was too frightened of everything happening around us to say it plainly. I love the way you never once made me feel like a burden, even that first night when I had nothing to offer but desperate circumstances. I love how you fought for this land, for those families, for me, without ever losing the fundamental decency that makes you who you are." Luke reached into his coat pocket then, and Lillian watched breath-catching as he withdrew a small ring, simple, unadorned, clearly not purchased with any romantic premeditation, but rather she would learn fashioned by Luke himself over several quiet evenings in the workshop behind the barn, using silver his father had left behind and never found occasion to use. "I know this isn't how you imagined this happening." He said something vulnerable and hopeful in his expression. "I know you came to Montana expecting a different kind of proposal entirely, one that turned out to be built on lies. I can't promise you the polished words Ethan Wallace put in his letters. I can only promise you honesty, hard work, and a love that won't ever ask you to be anything other than exactly who you are." "Luke Garrett," Lillian said, laughing through fresh tears. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking," he confirmed, "if you'll choose to stay. Not because circumstances left you with nowhere else to go, but because you want to build a life here with me on land that's already started feeling like it belongs to both of us." "Yes," Lillian said without a single second of hesitation, the word carrying all the certainty that had been building in her heart since that very first strange, honest offer he'd made her on a darkening platform 2 months earlier. "Yes, Luke. I choose Promise Creek. I choose this ranch and Silas's terrible jokes and Boone's earnest ma'am and every hard, honest day ahead of us. I choose you." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her all along, which in every way that mattered, it had. They married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch, attended by Silas and Boone, by Sheriff Combs, and his wife, by Amelia Delacroix, and her family, her young son fully recovered and running underfoot, with an energy that made Lillian's heart swell with gratitude every time she saw him. Word had spread through Promise Creek of everything that had happened. The fraud exposed the families, restored the wedding of the rancher, and the woman who'd once been left abandoned at the station, and the town that had first looked at Lillian with pity now looked at her with something closer to admiration, understanding at last that she had never been the tragedy of this story, but rather its quiet, determined heroine. Howard Sinclair stood trial 2 months after his arrest, the overwhelming weight of evidence Lillian and Luke had helped assemble, leaving no room for doubt in the jury's verdict. He was sentenced to 20 years, his banking empire dismantled, his ill-gotten land holdings returned or auctioned to benefit the very families he'd nearly destroyed. Justice, slow and imperfect as it often was on the frontier, had nonetheless found its way to him in the end. As for Ethan Wallace, the con man, whose betrayal had first sent Lillian's world spinning into crisis, word eventually reached Promise Creek that he'd been arrested in Wyoming territory, running the same tired scheme on another desperate woman, his pattern of cowardice finally catching up with consequences he could no longer outrun. Lillian felt upon hearing the news, not vindication exactly, but something quieter and more complete. The understanding that his betrayal, however painful it had ultimately redirected her toward a life infinitely richer than the one his lies had promised. On the evening of their wedding day, as the last guests departed and the ranch settled into peaceful quiet under a sky brilliant with stars, Luke found Lillian standing on the same porch where he'd first kissed her, where Sinclair's men had once threatened everything they were building, where 2 frightened, careful people had slowly, deliberately chosen to stop being careful and start being honest instead. "Any regrets, Mrs. Garrett?" he asked, testing her new name with evident satisfaction. "Only one," Lillian said, smiling as she leaned back against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with easy familiarity. "That I spent so many years believing safety and survival mattered more than genuine belonging. It took a con man's betrayal and a banker's cruelty to finally show me what real love actually looks like." "And what does it look like?" "It looks like a man who offered a stranger honest work instead of false promises," she said. It looks like standing beside someone through fire and gunfire and every hard truth in between and choosing again and again to stay anyway. She turned in his arms to face him fully, the moonlight catching the quiet joy in both their expressions. It looks like finally understanding that I wasn't abandoned at that station, Luke. I was simply waiting without knowing it for exactly the right person to find me there. You've been waiting for me, Luke said, echoing his very first words to her, spoken now, not as a stranger's strange observation, but as a truth both of them had finally fully claimed. No, Lillian said softly, repeating the answer she'd given him once before, in the aftermath of danger and fear, when she'd finally understood the deeper truth of everything that had happened since that abandoned platform. I was waiting to find where I belong. And I found it here with you on this land, in this life we've built together. Above them, the Montana sky stretched vast and star-scattered toward mountains that had witnessed every part of their story. The fear, the danger, the slow, careful building of trust into something unbreakable. And Luke Garrett pulled his wife close, understanding at last that everything he'd once believed unsurvivable had instead become the very foundation of a happiness he'd spent 6 long years afraid to hope for again. Sometimes the life you plan for yourself collapses entirely, taken apart by another person's cruelty or cowardice, leaving nothing behind but broken promises and a platform full of strangers who look at you like a burden. And sometimes, in the wreckage of that collapse, something far better waits to be found. Not because fate arranged it, but because 2 people tested by fire and danger, and hard, honest truth, chose each other anyway, and built something real from everything the world had tried to take from them. Lillian Foster had crossed 1,000 miles, searching for a home that turned out to be built on lies. She found instead a belonging she never could have imagined, earned through courage, through honesty, through the simple, unshakable choice to stay and fight for what mattered, no matter the cost. And in the end, that choice made all the difference.